Starfield is a game that is polarizing for good reasons. On one hand, I can see why some people enjoy the game, and on the other hand, I can see how some people think a 7 out of 10 is too generous for the game. However, the biggest issue that games like Starfield brings up isn't obvious unless you know more about how games are made. We just went through the same issue with Baldur's Gate 3. Because of both of these games now, we now have two horrible new standards, and people are going to suffer because of them. When we think of video games today, what do those games need to have in them bare minimum? In other words, what is the required number of stuff generally in-game to make it like an average game on like a 1 to 10 scale, let's say? The reason I bring this up is that we need to understand exactly what we are demanding or what game devs are estimating they can achieve in their video games. So, going back in time for just a second, let's see what the standard used to be. Yes, children, welcome to the ye olden times of 2003. Ooh. The game you're bearing witness to? Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 1. This game was the predecessor to the legendary Mass Effect series and really set the stage for that BioWare formula we would see built. However, what's more important is we need to see what this game actually was and the standard it set. Kotor 1 had a story that focused around a young, Force-sensitive Republic soldier, where at one point, you of course find out a terrifying twist about who you are. You could only visit 6 planets. Only 6. And the game was based around a very D&D based system where you had main stats like wisdom, strength, etc. You could make crazy awesome RPG choices, revolving around being either a fairly comic bookish type villain bad guy, or being the goody two-shoes Jedi paragon of virtue. The main point though was that this game was roughly 40 hours long, had a ton of voice dialogue in it, requiring tons of hours of recording to get them all done. And this combat system you've been watching was hailed as dynamic at the time. But Kotor 1 was a very tightly focused game. Many of the maps were tightly containing the player. You didn't have tons of open space to explore, and that's the point. This game was not open world, and it did not offer anywhere near the amount of player freedom we experience today. Yet, ask anyone in 2003, and Kotor was revolutionary and set the standard for what would come after it. However, this standard set in 2003 by Kotor was more than reachable. So what came afterward? Ah, yes, the granddaddy of them all, Skyrim. We all know exactly why this game is one of the greatest action-adventure RPGs to ever grace the market. Here we saw the open-world game come into its own with tons of skills to choose from, places to go, and people to talk to, and of course, situations to decide the fate of Skyrim. However, this is where we started to see the first cracks show. Skyrim was the new standard. Players loved the ability to go anywhere, do anything, and in this game, devs heard and they listened. If you're not a fan of economics, then good for you, you're normal. But for those of us who love to bore women on dinner dates, there's this general principle in a market economy. Always be growing. Stagnation is the enemy. Kotor sets a new standard, we must outdo it. Skyrim sets the new standard, and all game devs rave that we must outdo it. It's a nice feeling to know that game devs and even fans are pushing for what can be done in video games. And in this, we find our #1 issue. As of today, in our pursuit to outdo the games of the recent past, to always be growing, we instead find ourselves stagnating, or even getting worse. For 8 years, Bethesda Game Studios toiled away on Starfield, and for 8 years, people who worked on Starfield were most likely worked to the bone in crunches. Starfield devs were not working on a Space Skyrim 2.0, they were creating 10 Skyrims, one on top of another. There is no way they were not overworked. And sadly, Starfield is the new standard. Bethesda's recent history attests to their crunch policy. Crunch being the unofficial policy of overworking your game devs immensely because you don't know how to make your game without implicitly torturing your developers. Todd Howard was even mentioned as one of the main people at Bethesda Game Studios that always focused on a, quote, bigger is better design philosophy, and in turn would require more from his devs that he personally probably didn't have to put in. But yet it gets worse when you take into account the mentality of the studios that do this, including Bethesda Game Studios. There's a story that some Bethesda developers believe that is special among big budget studios, that its scrappiness can overcome any major creative challenge. Compared to Ubisoft Montreal with over 3,500 employees, Bethesda Game Studios only has around 400 employees at the time of publication. And when you consider that Fallout 4 and Skyrim have gone on to sell millions of copies, were made with only around 100 people at the time, the self-mythologizing becomes easy to believe. Some developers who were used to crunching with relatively small teams were convinced that they could make the same magic happen on Fallout 76. This kind of mentality that constantly forces us to continue making games bigger and bigger until eventually the bubble pops. But for the ones like Todd Howard who mismanaged their staff to such an extent they needed them to work 5 times the amount of hours other employees would, they aren't the ones to face these consequences. Those consequences being time missed with family and friends, and living a fulfilling life, and instead are grinded until they can no longer hold their relationships together, having to choose between a job they will most likely lose due to unnecessary layoffs or keeping their sanity. Starfield, almost without question, most likely had major crunches happen in production, but due to the scale of Starfield, it was most likely the worst version of crunch that may have happened yet. Starfield is a game with a scale unlike anything that came before it. It is now the standard. We cannot keep trying to outdo everything, as we are seriously at the point of playing a game of chicken on who can sprint closer to the edge of the cliff fastest and not fall off. Games are becoming, or attempting to become, something they cannot be, which is unlimited in their scale. And Starfield is the game that has now pushed this idea the farthest, as they were the team to truly start relying on procedurally generated work to fill this mammoth project. Planets are simple carbon copies with repeated buildings, oftentimes in the same plots. And how exactly did the devs manage to record all of the lines of dialogue necessary for even the equivalent of gas station clerks to have their own unique voice actor? And then, of course, finish it off with a dash of what I assume had to be an automated system to make it possible for them to animate the tens of thousands of faces in the game. Starfield is not a game to be envied, nor should it be one that any dev team attempt to outdo, as in the attempt you will find yourself expending money you may not have, or obviously be running down the physical and mental health of the people who work under you. Starfield is a true threat to the industry, as it now seems that many want this game to be the standard by which we will judge future games on. Oh, we can visit 50 handcrafted planets in your game? Starfield had 1,000, and repeated on the loop. There is no such thing as unlimited growth, nor is there unlimited time and budget to make a video game. Eventually, the gaming industry will need to change course and focus on the changes necessary to make a great game with less time and a health-draining formula. However, sadly, we know it won't. Game devs are being instilled with this feeling to go farther and be given praise for pushing themselves past their limits time and time again, not for their benefit, but just so Starfield can get to 1,000 boring, meaningless planets. Sorry for ranting at the end, but I just wanted to touch on this issue and the human cost that will come with games like this. Games like Starfield cannot be the standard. Just replace Starfield with Baldur's Gate 3, a game I love, and I will say the exact same thing. I once heard someone say a quote, and I didn't understand it at first, but now I really get it. It goes, "I want shorter games with worse graphics made by people who are paid more to work less," and no, I'm not kidding. And that pretty much sums up my feelings about games like Starfield. If you like the video, please be sure to subscribe, like the video, or dislike it. YouTube doesn't care. My mental health is your plaything, blah, blah, blah. You can, say whatever you want about me as long as it's a comment. Nobody cares. Talk about my forehead. Do whatever you need to do. Follow me on Twitter, or X, at Braden Voice, at BRAYDEN Voice. Spelled the exact same way if you need me to spell voice for you. You've got more problems than I do, friend. Goodbye.